Welcome everybody to this week's History at Home. Tonight we're going to be talking about Olmsted, who is celebrating his 200th birthday this year. Well, he would be if he were alive. And it's going to be by Lisanne Renner, who, if you've ever been to one of her presentations before, you know they're phenomenal. So I'm looking forward to it. If you would like to donate to the Montclair History Center, you know how much I love that. And you can do it by going on our website and clicking the donate button. Very simple. We accept Venmo, we accept Zelle, and you can also write us a check if you feel like going that route, the old school route. So anything that you can do to support us would be very, very grateful at this time. With that, I am going to turn it over to Lisanne. Lisanne is the co-founder and historian at with Friends of Anderson Park, which is a delightful little gem in the middle of Montclair. She got her MS in Historic Preservation from Columbia University, and she was also the lead researcher and author on the National Register nomination for Anderson Park. So she knows quite a bit about the park, but tonight she's actually going to expand that because Olmsted did not just do parks. Olmsted did a lot more, and a lot more than just Anderson Park. So she is going to look more broadly at all of the things that Olmsted has done. And I just want you to know that in the fall, we've already spoken to somebody who's going to do a presentation on Olmsted that's even broader, that is all about Olmsted's different imprints throughout the United States, if you will. So with that, Lisanne, if you want to share your screen, that would be terrific.
Okay, just a minute.
This is Peter Moy. I'm not sure you hear me, but I was just in the Biltmore, and that portrait is hanging in the Biltmore.
Yes, that's right. So this is a portrait of Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. that's hanging in Biltmore. He designed the grounds for Biltmore, and the painting is by John Singer Sargent. So yes, good eye there. So
FYI, I was just down in Asheville as well last week, and at the Botanic Gardens, not part of Biltmore, but they had a major exhibit on Olmsted. So he's in the news.
I'm jealous that I didn't get to go to that. But what you bring up is interesting because as this very month, April, is the bicentennial of Frederick Law Olmsted's birth, and there are celebrations of this being held nationwide, in North Carolina, in New York City, all over the country, and we'll be celebrating in Montclair too. So Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. had an enduring influence that goes beyond just parks, and a number of the examples of projects that he influenced are in Montclair. Now, he didn't actually design the projects in Montclair because he died in 1903 before they were built. However, he set the tone for his successor firm, Olmsted Brothers, which designed quite a lot in this area. So we're going to talk about that today. So first, let's talk about Frederick Law Olmsted Sr., who's the person that most people think of when they think of Olmsted. He's the one whose 200th anniversary we're celebrating this April. He was born April 26, 1822, and he died, as I mentioned, in 1903, which was actually the year that Anderson Park's property was donated to Essex County Park System. So he was pretty much out of commission before most projects in the Montclair area were developed. Now, most people think of him as a landscape architect, which is definitely what he is best known for, but he also had a much broader history of activities. He was, for example, an anti-slavery journalist. He traveled the South for the New York Times under the byline Yeoman and wrote about conditions of slavery, what that was like. He reported that to Northern readers of the New York Times. And he was also an administrator for something called the U.S. Sanitary Commission during the Civil War. And that was essentially a precursor to the Red Cross. Now, his firm started in 1857, and it lasted long after his death and the death of his two sons into 1979. So that firm had quite a long run. It is, as we mentioned, best known for parks. Olmsted was a co-designer of Central Park in New York City, and he also was, his firm himself, with a little bit of involvement, and then his successor firm was the primary designer of almost all the Essex County park system in New Jersey. But this firm designed, as I mentioned, much more than parks. It designed college campuses, subdivisions, the grounds for World's Fair, Yosemite National Park, part of the US Capitol grounds. And if you were rich enough, you could hire the Olmsteds to design the grounds for your own private backyard or front yard. So in its 122 years, the firm worked on thousands of projects around the country. And of those thousands of projects, about a dozen of them touched on Montclair in one way or another, starting with Eagle Rock Reservation in the late 19th century and ending with Mills Reservation in the 1950s and 60s. So tonight I'm going to discuss the highlights of some of these projects that touch on Montclair. Before I jump into that, though, I do want to just give you a very, very brief sense of sort of what Olmstedian design characteristics tend to include. So his landscapes tended to be naturalistic rather than formal. He drew from the pastoral landscapes of England more than, say, from the formal geometric gardens of, say, France or Italy, but we will see some exceptions to that in tonight's program. You'll also see a lot of sort of sinuous curving pathways. Straight lines were not very common. Often there's an open meadow that contrasts with a more wooded area. And although these landscapes often look as if nature created them, many of them are also actually very highly engineered and highly planned, with plant species that are selected the way a painter might select colors and textures. It's also important to note that Olmsted, when he created parks, he wanted to create a peaceful effect that would soothe the spirit. This was important to him. He understood what I think most of us accept now, that the connection to the outdoors can improve not just your physical health, but also your mental health. He was highly aware of that. Now, I mentioned that Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. died in 1903, and his firm was taken over by his stepson, John Charles Olmsted, who you see here on the left, and his son, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. And even as early as the 1895, Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. was in declining health. So he had a little bit of involvement in the very early projects of the Essex County Park System, but his involvement was tapering off as the park system was kicking off. And instead, these two men that you see here tended to be the lead designers of the Essex County parks and also a lot of the other projects in Montclair and around the country. And they originally worked with their father early on, like in the 70s and 1870s and 80s as well. So they were very well versed in his design tenets. I also want to make it very clear that when we speak about the Olmsteds, we're not just talking about one or two people that are running around the country doing thousands of projects. They had a staff of designers working out of Brookline, Massachusetts, where this photo is taken. Their firm was run very in a very highly organized fashion. These are a few of the employees in 1903. So this is what some fellow designers would have looked like around the time, for example, that Anderson Park was being designed. Now, the Olmsted firm did a wide range of projects in Montclair. Parks and reservations, I think a lot of you are very familiar with already, but they also did public and private projects. And the variety of projects includes the grounds of a church, a number of private estates, i.e. the landscapes for private mansions in town. They designed a subdivision. They came up with they had a role, and we'll discuss it later, in a town-wide plan proposal for Montclair. They also had a hand in, but didn't come to fruition, a war memorial for Montclair. They were involved in a parkway proposal, and they also did, believe it or not, a parking lot. So the firm had overall 23 job files, what they called job files in Montclair, which was more than any other city in New Jersey except for Newark. And those 23 job files spanned a half a century. All but one of these projects came after Anderson Park was developed. So I do believe that the park probably stimulated interest in the Olmsted design in town. Also, I want to make it clear that not all of these jobs made it beyond the drawing board or even beyond letters with potential clients. So about half of these 23 job files were ultimately realized. And today, some of these plans endure quite magnificently, while others just leave merely traces, if even that. So since the Olmsteds are best known for their parks, and since parks and reservations were their first projects to touch Montclair, let's start there. The firm designed nearly all of Essex County's parks, which make the first countywide park system in the nation, which is fairly significant. Of those parks and reservations, 5 of them fall within Montclair. So in chronological order, we have Eagle Rock Reservation first, then Anderson Park, followed by Glenfield Park, Brookdale Park, and Mills Reservation. Now, the first project to touch on Montclair is Eagle Rock Reservation, which got its start as an Olmsted design in 1896. And it includes parts of Montclair, West Orange, and Verona, and coverage of over 400 acres. So Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. may have had a hand in the initial planning of Eagle Rock Reservation, but it was largely handled by the successor firm run by his sons. Now, with the cliffs affording an impressive view, even before New York City's skyscrapers, Eagle Rock was a very popular tourist resort years before Essex County Park System acquired the land. It had a private home, a cafe, a beer garden, an ice cream pavilion, and a guest house. The Olmsted design came in and removed those buildings and put the emphasis on the view over the cliff. And you see a little bit of the cliff in the right-hand side here. This is one of the Olmsted plans. There were many, many plans prepared for the Eagle Rock Reservation, but this is the windy entrance road to Eagle Rock Reservation from Upper Mountain Avenue in Montclair. And some people call it Snake Road for obvious reasons. This was drawn in 1899. This is a plan for planting and woods improvement for Eagle Rock in 1910. Interestingly, you would think that the woods, I mean, we look at these woods and we think of the woods in Eagle Rock as being very natural, but in fact, the Olmsteds thinned out certain trees and planted other kinds of trees. So it's not completely natural. There was sort of engineering, if you will, on the part of the Olmsteds. And they also gave very detailed consideration to roads, to altering the woods a little bit, to developing hiking paths, bridleways for horseback riders, and other things like that. As you can see also that they gave sections of the park or the reservation different names, which I think for most of us are lost to time. Most people have no idea that there are these sections with specific names, but I do want to point out this one right here, which is called High Lawn. This is the area, just the grassy area right behind the overlook that you're so familiar with. And it also gives the name to High Lawn Pavilion, or now it's called just the High Lawn Restaurant. That's where they took their name from. Now, in 1912, Essex County built what was called an open air casino, and casino has absolutely nothing to do with gambling. Here, it's the meaning comes from the Italian word for a small country villa. And this was originally an open air building. It fell into very bad shape over the decades. And then I believe in the 1980s or early 90s was restored as a restaurant and took its name, as I said earlier, from the grassy area behind the cliff called High Lawn. So, and many Olmsted designs will have a grassy area. Anderson Park has a grassy area. Central Park, of course, has a grassy area. Eagle Rock has its own little grassy area. And if you go to the High Lawn restaurant, be sure to order the Olmsted cocktail. There's a cocktail called the Olmsted Viking, pays homage to Olmsted and to the bartender whose nickname is Viking. And it's very green, which I think is good for an Olmsted cocktail. Now, the next Essex County park to open in Montclair was Anderson Park, which is just 14 acres, and the land was donated by Charles Anderson, who was an insurance executive. He donated it to become a Essex County park. And I feel as if Anderson Park sort of became a billboard for the Olmsted firm in Montclair, because a lot of people saw it and wanted more of it. And nearly all the Olmsted projects in Montclair came after Anderson Park, as I mentioned earlier. Now, through Anderson Park, we can sort of learn a little bit about the Olmsted's process of creating a park. So one of the first steps to take place would be for one of the Olmsteds, in this case, John Charles Olmsted, to visit a proposed site. So in the case of Anderson Park, Essex County had been offered this park as this land as a donation, and before they accepted it and decided they wanted to make this property part of their Essex County park system, they called in the Olmsteds to come take a look. So in August of 1902, John Charles Olmsted came to the property. He brought along his Kodak camera and a notepad, and he photographed the site under consideration. So this picture was taken by John Charles Olmsted in 1902, probably roughly standing somewhere just a little south of where Bellevue Avenue is now, looking southwest toward First Mountain. And you see two houses that at one time were on that property and were moved when the park was developed. Now, Olmsted, when he would go to a site to assess it, would take something called field notes, where he would just, in a notebook, write down his observations, his thoughts about the site, maybe the real estate conditions. Sometimes he might mention the political realities of something surrounding the site. And then these would get typed up later, which is what you see on the right here. These are the field notes that he wrote for Anderson Park. And then he would report back to Essex County Parks Commission on what he thought. And then in the evening, when he was maybe going home on a train or back at his hotel room, he would write a letter to his wife, Sophia, talking about what he did that day. And you see a page of that letter here where he did talk about his visit to Anderson Park, or the future Anderson Park. Now, the Olmsteds envisioned 4 types of parks generally, and that applies to the Essex County parks as well. So those types were the natural reservations, which are represented by Eagle Rock and Mills, playgrounds and neighborhood parks, which would be Glenfield Park, for example, and Anderson Park, large city parks, probably Brookdale would fit into that category, and scenic parkways. We'll talk about those a little bit later. This photograph here it's a postcard that shows Glenfield Park when it had a wading pool. And this was, as I mentioned, a 20-acre neighborhood park that was developed just south of Bloomfield Avenue starting around 1909 on a site that used to be used for industry. And it also had a poorhouse on it before it became a park. So Glenfield Park, as I mentioned, was started in 1909. This particular map of it is from 1912. If you look in this corner in the lower left-hand corner at the intersection of Bloomfield Avenue and Maple Avenue, this is where the wading pond is that you saw in the previous slide. And these two picturesque bridges used to be part of Glenfield Park, crossing Tony's Brook. These bridges unfortunately no longer exist, although there are utilitarian bridges that are still in the Glen area of Glenfield Park. The wading pool that you saw a picture of and the pavilion that was in the background of that wading pool postcard, they no longer exist either. So this kind of gives you some sense of how these parks, both their plantings and their infrastructure, can deteriorate over time. And often little of the original design intent remains. But at least on the plus side, the recreational open space still survives, which is always a good thing. Big changes are planned for Glenfield Park. Essex County has plans to replace the current field house with a 10,000 square foot community center, which you see on the right-hand side here, and to upgrade the football field. So if these two projects are both carried out, they would be completed in early 2023. So it'd be a very different kind of park than it was in 1909. Now the parkways that I talked to you about, this is a map of the proposed parkway system that the Olmsteds designed in 1905. And the concept was to connect all these different parks so that maybe, say, on Sunday, you could take a Sunday drive or a Sunday carriage ride and go from one park to another, just for sort of a scenic outing. And these very, very, very few of these were actually built. I think really only one segment was, none of it in Montclair, although there was a plan to have this parkway that would have run along South Mountain Avenue and Upper Mountain Avenues, linking Eagle Rock Reservation and Anderson Park. But as we know, that never did happen. Now, Brookdale Park was started around 1928, and it's partly in Montclair and partly in Bloomfield. And the basic work for it was in place by 1930, but the Depression, of course, hit, and the remaining work, because of the Depression, took much longer to complete. Now, this photo shows Brookdale Park's oval track under construction as late as 1935. So you get a sense of how long that project was delayed by the Depression. Now, this 1940 map of Brookdale Park really gives you an idea of the curving lines that I was talking about that are so prominent in many Olmsted designs. As I said, you rarely see straight lines. This park's layout is, in 1940 was all about curving lines. Now, during the Depression, part of the Brookdale Park construction was carried out by the Depression-era Works Progress Administration, as well as the Emergency Relief Administration. And Brookdale was one of the few WPA construction projects that I'm aware of that benefited Montclair. So finally by 1937, the major work was finished on Brookdale Park, which is now about 121 acres. Now, Edgemont Park is a bit complicated because a lot of people, and I've seen many township planning documents that say that Edgemont Park was designed by the Olmsteds, but it really wasn't, although the Olmsteds did have a hand in it early in the game. Originally, when this park was created around 1906, it was called Harrison Park. And the firm, the Olmsted firm, was initially hired by the township to design the park, but the relationship soured fairly quickly. I think town officials felt that the firm was too expensive. That was part of the problem. Whoops, excuse me. The Olmsteds, with John Charles Olmsted in particular, before the township and Olmsted firm parted ways, John Charles Olmsted visited the site. He prepared 4 pages of field notes and a 9-page preliminary report with recommendations. The firm also drew up a topographical map and a conceptual study, but they never produced a formal design and they never produced a planting plan. The study that we see here on this slide from 1909 actually bears very little resemblance to the park that we know now. You see on the bottom of the slide is where Valley Road is, and that there are like 3 circles that you can see on that slide, which represent a little folks lawn, a girls playground, small wading pool. And then on the left-hand side of the park in this image, you see 6 tennis courts where today's playground is. Now, the Olmsteds actually advocated for burying Tony's Brook underground. At the time, I think there was some raw sewage that flowed through Tony's Brook. So it was not considered something that you would really want to make the centerpiece of your park. And the Olmsted plan also did not include a pond at all in this park. So if the Olmsteds were not the primary designers of this Edgemont Park, who were? We don't actually completely know. The local landscape architects, Eric and Diana von Hoffman, did research into this, trying to determine who deserves credit, but couldn't come up with a firm name. My hunch is that it was township employees and that the design was rather incremental as money became available. The town was essentially delayed investing much effort into the park initially because it kept hoping Essex County would come in and take over the park and make it part of the Essex County park system, which never happened. However, I believe that the credit for the concept of opening up Tony's Brook into a pond probably should go to Frank W. Crane, who was the township engineer. And in 1907, he presented this idea of a pond, which we see here in this slide, 2 years before the Olmsteds were even hired. So he probably deserves the credit for that idea. Now, the Olmsteds had another close encounter with Edgemont Park that also did not come to fruition. And this was a soldiers and sailors monument meant to commemorate the Montclair men who died in World War I. The town lost 71 citizens in that war and was grieving them. And in 1919, it wanted to honor their sacrifice with a memorial, an official memorial in town. So it hired the Olmsteds to explore where to locate this memorial and what it should look like. So the Olmsteds focused on this site. To orient you, this is Valley Road here. North is over here. Orange Road is here. The Board of Ed buildings are here. This building right here is Hillside School. So I hope that gives you some orientation of where you are. The monument would have been right in this area here, directly across the street from what was then the municipal building, where now I believe it's the police headquarters. So it would have been, this monument would have been at the intersection of Valley Road and Bloomfield Avenue, looking in this direction toward Hillside School. Here's a sketch of how this monument would have radiated outward. Again, the monument is here at the intersection of Valley Road and Bloomfield Avenue. And there would have been allays of trees and pathways throughout the property. And again, to help you get your orientation, this is Hillside School. These are the Board of Ed buildings. The Olmsteds saw this as a monumental western gateway to Montclair, and they called it the Memorial Common. This gives you a sense of what that would have looked like. So again, where you saw the sort of little circle from which the allays radiated outward, that's what you have right here, this memorial. Back here is Hillside School. Back here is what used to be the Montclair High School, now demolished, and the playground of Hillside School. So you get a sense of how they envisioned this memorial to World War I. That never happened, of course. This is what is there now. Valley and Bloom occupies that site where that memorial had been proposed. Now, the township didn't choose the location, obviously. Instead, they chose Edgemont Park to be the site of their war memorial. The committee made this decision, and they preferred a more central location on property that was owned by the township, thus Edgemont Park, which was unveiled as a memorial park in 1925. And of course, it's still used today on Memorial Day and Veterans Day for ceremonies and events, as you see here in this photo. And this is the original program for when it opened in 1925. And yet another instance where the Olmsted firm came close to being influential on a project in Montclair, but was not, was in connection with the Nolan plan of 1908-1909. Now, this plan was a planning document for envisioning how Montclair could be improved and beautified. And a group called the Municipal Art Commission in 1908 commissioned John Nolan, who was a pioneering city planner, to come up with this comprehensive planning document that would make Montclair more functional and more beautiful. And this plan was heralded as an early example of regional planning. But before John Nolan was hired to do this plan, the Municipal Art Commission first tried to hire the Olmsted firm to do this plan. They wanted them to take the job. And there was a flurry of telegrams that went back and forth between the Municipal Art Commission and the Olmsteds, trying to get the Olmsteds to take on this job. But the Olmsteds were basically just too busy. They were involved at that time with Yosemite, planning Yosemite, and also big projects in Chicago. And there was also that concern again that they were too expensive. So the Olmsteds did not wind up doing the John Nolan took that plan instead. And this slide shows you a rendering from the Nolan plan of the what was called the Montclair Center, where a number of roads came together. Now, although the commission quickly pivoted to John Nolan after things fell through with the Olmsteds, John Nolan did have a strong connection to the Olmsteds because He had been a student of Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. in the landscape architecture program at Harvard just a few years before he prepared his plan for Montclair. And his plan was published as a book. And at the beginning of the book is a quote that Nolan chose, a quote by Frederick Law Olmsted Sr., which discusses the necessity of beauty, but also practicality in urban planning. And this text on the left is that quote from Olmsted that was in the book. So in a way, in terms of influence, I think the Olmsted had a little bit of backdoor influence on the Nolan plan, although it was really all Nolan ultimately. Now, most of what we talked about so far has been public projects, but the Olmsted firms, as I mentioned, if you were rich enough, you could hire them to design your own personal yard or gardens around your mansion. And there were a number of Montclair residents that did just that. And many of these homeowners had become familiar with the Olmsted's work because of the Essex County Park System, seeing Anderson Park and other parks that had been done by the park system. So some of the major clients that we're going to discuss today, and there are more than just these three, but I sort of chose my favorites. One is the home of William Eschbach, who was a lumber baron initially and then became a stockbroker. The home of Solomon Wright Jr., who owned the Wright Health Underwear Company, and Edmund B. Osborne, who was a senator and a publishing magnate. So let's start with William Eschbach's home, which you may know as Stone Eagles, which is at 60 Undercliff Road. It was built in 1929. It's on the National Register of Historic Places now. The architects for the house itself were Goodwillie and Moran, and they built this house for William H. Eschbach and his wife Mabel. As I mentioned, he was a stockbroker. He was also a former lumber magnate in Canada, where he was known for helping to open the Gulf of St. Lawrence to timbering. This home is probably one of the most fabulous homes in Montclair, and it takes its name from the two eagle sculptures that are perched atop the gate pillars that you see here. So I want you to look for a minute before we go to the next slide to sort of try to remember what this landscape looks like. You see boulders here. This is a picture from a few years ago. You see boulders here, but not much right here in the way of landscaping. Now this picture is from around 1930, when the landscaping was in full flower. You see here a lot of lush landscaping in the 1930s. Now, although this particular section of the landscaping is not there anymore, we'll see in more photos that at the rear and side of this home, there is still very much the flavor of the original Olmsted design. This is William Eschbach and his wife Mabel in the garden at Stone Eagles around 1930. This is the rear of Stone Eagles, where you see a layout very much like the one that the Olmsteds designed. Now, some of the plantings themselves are different, but the sort of the outline is the same, and I'll show you a little bit more about that in a minute. One of the things that I find really interesting about this 2.6 acre property, which is contoured into the slope of First Mountain, it's kind of a doubly special thing here, because this is a private home with an Olmsted landscape that immediately borders a public Olmsted landscape, which is Eagle Rock Reservation. This property abuts Eagle Rock Reservation, right where that windy snake-like road is that we looked at earlier. So keep in mind this layout and this circular pattern here. And you can see that in this Olmsted plan for the flower garden at Stone Eagles. This is the circle we were just looking at. Now, one thing that's interesting here, earlier I talked about how the Olmsted designs tend to be sort of very naturalistic as opposed to formal. This, however, is definitely a formal design. This is something you might see in a French or an Italian garden. So this isn't all fully that characteristic of the Olmsteds, whereas this part here, where it gets a little wilder and looser, would probably be a little more what the Olmsteds are better known for. Now, if you look at this map, each little shape has two numbers or numbers in it, and they correspond to what type of plant would be planted there, and perhaps how many of those plants would be planted there. Now, I don't think that these plants are necessarily the same plants that were on the Olmsted plan, although I don't know that for a fact. But definitely there was a major effort here to preserve the Olmsted layout and to keep some of the Olmsted plan alive, which is, I think, a really nice gesture on the part of the homeowner. Now, our next person who hired the Olmsteds was Solomon Wright Jr. He was a big Olmsted fan. He and his wife Ida hired the Olmsteds to design the grounds for 2 of their homes and also for a subdivision that he wanted to develop. Now, Solomon Wright was a president of the Wright Health Underwear Company. This is a 1901 ad for his wool long johns. He was also, probably equally importantly, a member of the Montclair Citizens Park Committee. So he would have been very familiar with the Olmsted's work for Essex County parks. Now, the Wrights, Ida and Solomon, this was their second house, roughly the same piece of property, which is at 122 Upper Mountain Avenue, and it was built around 1914. They hired the Olmsteds with John Charles Olmsted and Fred Dawson, also at the Olmsted firm, advising them on exactly where to site their home. Now, if you go past this home now, which is at the corner of Upper Mountain and Edgewood, there's really, I think, probably nothing left of the original landscape design, although maybe some of the large trees that are there now would have been there at the same, would have been planted or sited by the Olmsteds. Now, as I mentioned, Wright also hired the Olmsteds to lay out a 40-acre subdivision around 1909, 1910. The land for his subdivision was on the summit and slope of First Mountain. It straddled the border of Montclair and Verona. It was bordered on the east side by Highland Avenue in Montclair and on the west side by Route 23 in Verona. But excavating this very steep and rocky terrain ultimately just proved too much. After 2 years of planning and with lots already staked out, Wright asked the Olmsteds to abandon the project. And about a half a century later, what we have on that site now is what you see here, the Claridge House condominiums in Verona. The third homeowner that we're going to talk about is Edmund B. Osborne. Now, he was president of American Color Type Company, which is a printing company. He also ran for governor in 1913, but didn't win. Then he ran for New Jersey State Senator in 1916. He did win, but unfortunately for him, he died in office a year later. Before that, he was active in Montclair beautification. He built his own mansion with an Olmsted landscape, which we'll look at in a minute. But he also, around his mansion, developed a 70-acre subdivision called Brookwood, which was also designed by the Olmsteds. And Brookwood was intended to be a very exclusive development. Osborne personally screened some of the people before they could buy property in this subdivision, which was originally going to have 25 homes on the 70 acres. So this upscale subdivision called Brookwood is probably the most complex Olmsted design in Montclair because it created Stonebridge Road and Sutherland Roads, and it involved laying out about 25 home lots. The Olmsteds had designed subdivisions elsewhere around the country, and in Montclair, where Osborne sold tracts, he was ensuring that this upscale neighborhood would surround his home, and he had many design restrictions on this property. And one of them was that every buyer was required to have a landscape architect lay out the grounds and site the building. Now, this is an ad for the Brookwood subdivision in 1915 in the Montclair Times, which touts the fact that the property was, quote, laid out by the leading naturalistic landscape architects of America. It was definitely envisioned as a sylvan expanse of stately homes. And in a 1907 letter to Osborne, John Charles Olmsted described just how much this particular project was in line with his philosophy of what suburbia should be, a place that is a respite from the city and, quote, as nearly as possible in harmony with the aesthetic qualities of the woodland as possible. This map shows you an Olmsted grading plan for Stonebridge Road in 1909. Now, the subdivision, as I mentioned, included deed restrictions to control architectural and landscaping elements. Some of the distinguishing characteristics of this subdivision, which most of us probably think of as part of the estate section now, some of its distinguishing characteristics were grand houses on large lots, curving roads like you see here, no straight lines here, low rustic stone walls that conformed in design, color, and material. And this particular stone wall is in front of 4 Stonebridge Road, which was Osborne's personal home. As I mentioned, as Edmund Osborne placed himself at the center of this development with a mansion, also called Brookwood, which was under construction around 1910. He hired the Olmsted firm to design its grounds. You can see in this magazine article a little bit of the grounds at the rear of the house. Again, as we saw with Stone Eagles, this is not what I would think of as a characteristic Olmsted naturalistic design. This is much more formal and geometric. You can see that same round radiating form here. But then when you look around this part of the grounds surrounding the house, it's much more what you would think of as an Olmsted design, more naturalistic, less formal. And as I mentioned, this property is now on the National Register of Historic Places. Now, after after Osborne died unexpectedly in 1917, his son took over dividing up lots for development. And the subdivision was a little bit slow to take off. A lot of the significant home construction didn't actually take place until the 1920s, and some was still taking place in the 1950s. So this development is now part of a 180-acre estate section historic residential district that is being proposed by Montclair Township. So it's possible that this could all become part of a township historic residential district at some point. I mentioned earlier that a church grounds was part of an Olmsted design in Montclair, and that would be the first Congregational Church at 40 South Fullerton Avenue. It was rebuilt in this fashion here after a fire, and the church hired the Olmsteds in 1926 to design the grounds for its Sunday school area. So this is the Olmsted plan for that area around the Sunday school. So again, to orient you, this is north right here where the crescent is. This is South Fullerton Avenue. And this is the Olmsted design around what was then the Sunday school. And now there is, in part of this, right here, in part of this Sunday school, there is a preschool, I believe, called Mother's Morning Out, which houses that building, uses that building. And so you can see there's really nothing left of that Olmsted plan. It's now the playground for the Sunday school at the church. Now, the good news, though, is that there is a group, a small group of people within the church who have just started exploring ways to bring back at least some of the Olmsted design to the church grounds. Now, perhaps the most unlikely Olmsted design in Montclair is just a simple parking lot, which was the Bellevue Avenue parking plaza. It's just north of the Bellevue Theater and just east of the Upper Montclair train station. Now, the reason I'm showing you this cover of a booklet is this was a booklet published by something called the Mountain Society of Upper Montclair. And this was a civic improvement, beautification organization. And this group in 1918 hired the Olmsted firm at its own expense to transform a somewhat chaotic and unattractive area east of the train station into an attractive landscaped parking plaza. And the idea being that you would step off the train, and instead of seeing sort of a messy parking area, you would see a nicely landscaped parking area. So this was the first plan that they came up with in 1918 for this parking lot. You can see that it's a fairly simple plan. Here's Bellevue Avenue, here's Lorraine Avenue, and they would have some plantings here and some plantings in the middle. This was a year later, they came up with this plan, which added more screening. The idea that they would screen the unattractive backsides of the commercial buildings that abutted the train station, that abutted the parking lot. Then in this, bear with me. In this photo from the 1920s, you get a little insight into how the parking lot area was planted. So this is the lot, and this is the Olmsted plantings, rather thick plantings there. And then this is, again, the same parking lot long before it had the middle divide down what we have now. You can see, again, much dense plantings on either side of it. So I think a parking lot is probably one of the more unusual projects that they would have done. Now, we started with a reservation, and we're going to end with a reservation because Mills Reservation, which started in 1954, was the last Olmsted design in Montclair. And at the same time, the Olmsted firm itself was winding down. John Charles Olmsted had died decades ago, around 1920. He was certainly no longer involved in the firm. Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. would die in 1957, while Mills Reservation was still in the planning stages. Now, Mills Reservation began with 118 acres donated by the DeVella Mills Foundation to the Essex County Parks Commission in 1954, and more land was acquired in the 1960s. And ultimately, Mills Reservation totaled 157 acres atop First Mountain. Now, part of that land was a former quarry, as you see in the postcard here on the right, and much of the rest of the property was very wooded. Now, the donation came with the stipulation that the land be preserved in its natural state. Yet the Olmsted design initially called for more intensive uses than you would think of in terms of a natural reservation. So it had called for parking sprinkled around for up to 300 cars at one point, camping and picnic sites, bathrooms, ball field, playgrounds, and horse stables. This 1961 preliminary plan shows some of those features. And if you're interested in a more in-depth history of Mills Reservation, Helen Fallon of the Montclair History Center prepared an entire slideshow on Mills Reservation, which I think is available on the History Center's YouTube channel, if you want to look into that. Now, the Olmsteds solicited community input, and when they got that community input, coupled with the stipulation that this be preserved in its natural state, the vision of intensive use of a natural landscape did not prevail. Now we're very fortunate that we have the wonderful wooded trails in the reservation, and a magnificent overlook of New York City. And we're very lucky to have the opportunity just a few miles from our homes to step into nature and get that restorative feeling that nature gives us, and that Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. wanted his landscapes to provide. The Olmsted's birthday, as I mentioned, is this month. Friends of Anderson Park is going to be celebrating with a big birthday party in May, on May 14th in the afternoon. So mark your calendars. We'd love you to join us. The actor Joseph Smith is going to be portraying Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. In about a 30 or 40-minute presentation. We're going to have live music, vintage bicycle display, children's activities, and the Montclair Environmental Commission will be giving away tree seedlings, which you can plant at home. So we really hope you can join us for that. I also want to thank all the people that helped me with photographic images and information and history to help me prepare this project today. And I also encourage you, if you have any questions or want to add anything, you can feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisanne. You can stop sharing your screen. You have a bunch of questions. I do want to mention that, yes, indeed, the Mills Reservation program is up on our YouTube channel. And you also can see a presentation from Kathleen Bennett on the Nolan plan if you're interested in that. And we have a presentation up there by Joseph Smith where he talks about what he does in order to get into characters like Olmsted. So we've got those three things on our YouTube channel. Easiest way to find that is go to montclairhistory.org. There's a little YouTube icon. Just click on that and it'll take you right to it. So here are some questions for you. The first one came very early on and it was from Raymond, and he said, why Montclair? Why were there so many Olmsted projects in Montclair?
I don't have a definitive answer, but I have two theories. One, I think because of the Anderson Park and some of the early, like the reservation, Eagle Rocky Reservation, gave people here a look at what there was, of what could be done. And so I think that that spurred some interest. Also, the fact that the Essex County Park System has so many properties that are either in Montclair or touch on Montclair, and all of their properties are at that time were designed by the Olmsted firm. Those are two reasons. And also, Montclair had money. So there were people who could afford, people who lived in Montclair who could afford to hire the Olmsteds, where maybe there was not such a high concentration of money in some other towns. So those would be my theories, but I don't think there's anything truly definitive that I would point to.
Feel free to jump in if you have other questions. Otherwise, I'll just go to the ones in the chat. I want to make sure everybody can catch. Yep, David, go for it.
Comment, not question. At the Olmsted presentation in Asheville, it said the junior dropped the junior in his name at a certain point after his father passed away, and that might be one of the sources for some of the confusion as to how many parks Senior did. And I was wondering if you had any reaction to that.
I didn't know he had dropped the junior. I mean, that definitely people are confused about when they hear that something's an Olmsted Park. I think a lot of people just instantly think of Olmsted and they think of Central Park. That's the reference point for most people. And that was Olmsted Senior. So, I think a lot of people don't have the nuanced timeline to necessarily understand that it was the successor firm that did so much of the work here because Olmsted Senior had already passed away.
I wanted to mention two things, Lisanne. I'm aware of another WPA project up at Montclair State, the amphitheater there was a
Oh, yes, thank you.
And the other thing was the interesting thing, you know, how the county asked the Olmsted firm to review land when it was offered. They actually recommended against the county taking the donation from the Devella Mills Foundation, but the county took it anyways.
Interesting. Okay. Do you know why they didn't want it?
I'm not remembering it off the top of my head.
Interesting. Okay. Thanks.
Well, no, you know what they wanted? They said only take it if you could also get the land around the reservoir. And they didn't get that. They wanted the whole kit and caboodle.
Got it.
Carol asks, what are the two small structures at the very rear of Two Eagle Estate?
At the very rear of Eagle Rock Reservation?
No, Two Eagles Estate. The Stone Eagle
Oh,
Estate.
Stone Eagles. What are
Sorry.
the buildings at the rear of them?
Carol?
When you were showing the photograph of the landscaping behind the estate on up the mountain, there was a small structure kind of built into the mountainside behind all the formal landscaping.
Oh, like, you know,
wonderful. And
I'd have to look more carefully. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I do know that the home itself had several wings. So, you know, when one of them was kind of like a pavilion, maybe open air at one point, but I don't know if that's the structure you're referring to. I know that there were going to be two descendants of the Espa family, who were hoping to participate. I don't know if they are here, and if they are, maybe they could answer that question. But I'm not visualizing what you're referring to. I'd have to go back and look at the photo.
you know, it looked like it could have been a spring house.
Yeah, it's
It's
possible.
like, you know, there could be water coming down from the reservation, but I am totally speculating.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I don't know the answer to that.
And Joanne shares that First Congregational Church is going to be seeing some preliminary design plans from the landscape architect next week. So that's exciting. That project is moving forward. Congratulations,
great.
Joanne.
That's wonderful. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, thanks. We're pretty excited too. So we'll see what he has to say.
I'm looking forward to seeing them if you're willing to share them.
See what happens. We can only wait till then.
Just seeing if there are any other questions here. A lot of
Yeah,
comments, a lot of, thank you so
I'm one
much.
of those Espa heirs, so let me tell you, I was only 7 years of age when I was last there. And I certainly do remember that there was a cold spring area that they used, but my cousin Judy, who is not on tonight, would probably know the answer to that. She was a year older than I was. I hardly remember. I remember the house. I was in the house, but at that point, my grandfather, I mean, he lived there for 12 years without paying anything because he went broke and the banks couldn't sell it.
Oh, wow.
So he was there from 1930 to 1942, 43, and he never paid a penny. No taxes, nothing.
Wow.
And then he moved to Gates Avenue in Montclair.
So I have a question for you, Lisanne. We actually got a phone call probably a month ago from somebody asking about the name Stonebridge Road. And I looked on an old map and saw that there was a small pond that had a bridge on it. And I speculated that perhaps it was stone, but I wondered if you know anything more about that.
I know a little about it because when I was researching, I did stumble into, I think it was even a photo in the Montclair Times of a stone bridge on Stonebridge in the vicinity of Stonebridge Road. It was very small. I mean, it wasn't like a significant bridge. Because when I saw that, bells went off in my head. And it's like, oh, okay. But I don't think it exists anymore. I mean, I've walked around Stonebridge Road a number of times and never spotted anything that looked remotely like a bridge. So I think that's long gone, but it did exist at one point.
Joanne asks, did the relaxing of Olmsted approach, formal arrangements, parking lots, et cetera, reflect the changing attitudes of the firm or responding to client wishes, or?
I don't know. I mean, I do think that in the cases where you have these mansions with sort of the formal design as opposed to the more naturalistic design, like those radiating circles and things, that could have either been the distinct wish of the client, the homeowner, or it could have been the wish of the architect who wanted that. And, the Olmsted's just obliged. Then in the 60s and the 70s, well, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, I assumed that the Olmsted firm was evolving like everybody else and changing. But, even in the Eagle Rock, excuse me, not the Eagle Rock, but the Mills Reservation project, they still were sticking with their sort of circular, sinuous kinds of forms. But I don't know much about their evolution, I'm afraid.
Anything else?
Yes, my name is Mike Rush. I was born and raised in Montclair, but lived most of my working life in the Massachusetts area. And the Olmsted business in Brookline, Massachusetts is now part of the National Park Service.
Right.
And in that building, they actually have drawings with overlays of what the original vision was that Olmsted had for the different parks and so on that they built all across the country. So what people have been able to do that want to duplicate what their original vision was, they've been able to go back to that archive, look at what their original vision was in terms of the overlays, been able to duplicate what their original vision was.
These, all of their, well, I don't know if all of them, but many of their plans are now digitized, and you can look them up really easily. Some of the plans that I used in this presentation tonight are from the Olmsted Historic Sites archives, and some of them are from the Essex County Parks archives. When Friends of Anderson Park formed, one of the first things we did was get the 1904 Olmsted planning plan from that very archive in Brookline. And we use that as a guide for replanting, but you can't do everything. Some things, first of all, it'd be enormously expensive. Second of all, there are things that might be invasives now that we wouldn't replant. But it's instructive just to see what the original intent was. And you also have postcards and photographs that show how densely planted a lot of these landscapes were.
Hi, my name is Peter Meyer, and my firm I was president of actually did master plans, not in Montclair, but for South Mountain Reservation.
Oh, wow.
Started one in Weequahic Park and did a lot of the infrastructure work for a firm that I think is Roadside Harwell that did the overall master plan for Branchbrook Park. Right. And we would go back to the archives, just as Mike Rush was describing, and get the original intentions for what it was. And of course, we were trying to bring it forward to today's usage for the parks, and also to fit in with Joe DiVincenzo's very active park, revisions. There was usually some tension between the county and county parks department and the conservancies that watched over the park, which was only natural. But it had been tremendous neglect over the century of maintaining the park to the original vision, or let's say somewhat evolving, from what it was. When you look at South Mountain Reservation and the road network, which brought you to Vista Points, people are not just cruising around in cars, like it was the turn of the century. So it was interesting to see the evolution and the philosophy of staying with a more respecting the Olmsted vision, but really staying to serve current population. And there's a lot of tensions along those decisions that are made. Particularly, you look at South Mountain Reservation and what were some of the meadows conceived by Olmsted and have turned into intense usages, by the current administrators of it. But those records are totally available, and we can see them.
One of the things that I really enjoy looking at those old records is you see things that were planned that never happened. Like there was a big amphitheater planned for Brookdale Park, never built. So you sort of see things that just fantasies that never came to fruition, which is for me a lot of fun.
I always thought with, I saw a lot of the design ideas for mills, and I just thought they, were taking, like, they had so many of those elements. They were like, well, here's the version where we have 2 ballparks and a bunch of playgrounds, and so they were just making those elements fit into that specific site as a possibility. I also think that they ran out of money in that, and not only did the community just want a passive park, but that suited their budget a little better too.
Yeah, that's probably true. And aren't you glad that it worked out that way? I mean,
Yes.
I love mills as it is.
Yes.
It's very interesting that if you really look at the plans for Central Park, that was all designed to be a very 19th century social engineering. It was a real response to, the explosive growth of New York City and the mixing of people of different classes. And the whole design of the park was very structured, that there would be separation and how kind of the masses could look upon those in the carriages and those on the bridle paths, but not mix with them. And I put into the chat, if you have a chance to look at the original designs for Central Park that Calvert Vaux and Frederick Law Olmsted submitted to New York City, they are just fascinating, because the park was really meant to be a landscape in the round. It was just like a Hudson River school, and they actually painted what every segment would look like after they were through with it. And it's just the most lovingly, presented proposal. This was a wonderful presentation. The other 2 parks I know of locally, it is kind of, as you said, was follow the money. Taylor Park in Milburn is an Olmsted, and Orange Park at the foot of Seven Oaks Park in Orange.
And Laura points out that Verona Park is also Olmsted.
Well, this is not a Montclair, but High Point State Park has an Olmsted Trail that has many of these features. It's a spiral going up a hill with offshoots for picnic areas, and it's been lovingly preserved. It's just a lovely little road. It's called Scenic Trail at High Point, and he was involved with the Olmsted brothers too.
Interesting.
Yeah. There's an interesting background on Weequahic Park. I know it's not the subject, but it is interesting. Rodney Frelinghuysen, a Republican from Morris County, who we know of, actually gave a $3 million grant when he was head of the Finance Committee to preserve the lake. So the Conservancy, Weequahic Park Conservancy, which was a very active group, I think it was the first conservancy established in Essex County and modeled after the Central Park Conservancy. They wanted to have a track going around the lake, or a surface that they could run on, because it was very important for the health of the community that lived in a Weequahic neighborhood. So when we went to the EPA to establish what they could do with this grant, the EPA administrator said, no, you can't do that. That's recreation. Well, I'm the engineer. And I said, no, that you have to have a path around, otherwise all the surface will erode and go into it. It would spoil the water quality. And they accepted it. Then, oh, we can fund that, all within 5 minutes. Couldn't fund it till you can fund it. Now that changed the entire nature of the park, because the population came out from dawn to dusk to use that active path around the 80-acre lake in Weequahic Park. And that's the insight of the Conservancy group, to say that this is what we need, this is what we want. And it really did change it from dumping bodies into the lake to the community usage of it. And I said, if people here have not gone around Weequahic, around the lake, just walk around it. It's magnificent. You're really young. Yeah.
I'm going to wrap it up with just one more comment that Raymond points out, that there's a statue of Olmsted in Branch Brook Park. So should you be going there to see the cherry blossoms, stop by and tap your hat to old Fred. So I'm I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. Lisanne, as always, your presentations, as everybody has said in the chat, are amazing, and we appreciate it very much. And I'm looking forward to May 14th and seeing the celebration in Anderson Park. Thank you for your work at Anderson Park and for this presentation.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Good night,
Thank you.
everybody.
Right.
Yeah.
Nice job.